That morning in England, one of the most exciting events in the world was about to take place. What happened to the captain, pilot, and passengers in the face of the emergency on board the plane has not been forgotten even years later. The story of British Airways Flight 5390, which surprised me many times while preparing the report, is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. June 10, 1990, Birmingham Airport, England. If everything had gone according to plan, the British Airways flight would have taken off from the UK and landed at Malaga Airport in Spain after a 2-hour journey. The day had started normally. The flight crew had gathered together before the flight. The experienced crew had known each other closely for years, except for the co-pilot. The experienced co-pilot had just joined the crew and would be making his first flight with this company that day. The captain pilot of the flight was Tim Lancaster, a 42-year-old pilot with more than 11,000 hours of flight experience. The captain took his place in the cockpit, completely unaware that he was about to experience the most challenging flight of his life, even the most challenging moments. The 39-year-old co-pilot had 7,500 hours of flight experience. Co-pilot Alistair Atchison also started to do external checks of the plane before boarding. The co-pilot did not find any abnormal situation on the plane after performing external checks. At that time, the captain pilot also examined the past maintenance records of the plane. This crucial part is very important. The aircraft had been out of maintenance only 1 day ago. When the captain pilot looked at the maintenance records, he did not find any severe situation. Only the windshield on the captain's side had been changed. 87 people, including 81 passengers and 6 crew members, boarded the plane. After completing their checks, they started taxiing to the runway. The plane for Flight 5390 was a BAC 111 made in the United Kingdom. Although this aircraft model is no longer in service, it was one of the most popular aircraft of its time. It was a practical jet used for regional flights. 244 were produced and it was an easy aircraft to maintain. It had a good safety record. The pilots completed their taxi and were at the runway at 8:20. They reported to the tower that they were ready for takeoff. Let's take a quick break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, so if you find it informative, please remember to subscribe and like. Your support allows us to create more content for you. After receiving clearance to take off, the pilots gave power to the engines. The plane gained speed on the runway, and when it reached takeoff speed within seconds, the pilots cut the wheels off and started climbing. There were no problems during the takeoff phase. 2 minutes into the takeoff, the pilots switched the plane to autopilot. The captain pilot took off his seatbelt to relax after switching the plane to autopilot. The cabin attendant came to the cockpit and asked the pilots what they wanted to drink and left the cockpit. The pilots were climbing from 16,000 feet to 17,000 feet. Their target altitude was 23,000 feet. It was only 13 minutes after takeoff when suddenly a loud explosion was heard in the cockpit. The window in front of the captain pilot exploded and flew out of the airplane. As the window flew out of the airplane, it also pulled the captain pilot and caused him to fly out of his seat. The captain pilot's feet were stuck in the yoke and his upper body came out of the plane, but his legs did not. The co-pilot, who was new to the company, could not understand what had happened. When he looked to his left, he saw that the captain pilot's feet were stuck in the yoke and his body was stuck outside the plane. Airplanes need to be pressurized as they reach high altitudes. The reason for the explosion and the captain being pulled out was this pressure difference. The flight crew initially thought it was a bomb. The captain and other items in the cockpit were thrown out of the open window. There was complete chaos in the cockpit. Everything was flying, and the air inside the airplane was creating fog in the cockpit and coming out. The captain's feet were stuck on the yoke, causing the yoke to get stuck in the forward position. This resulted in the plane both gaining speed by going nose down and the plane getting off the autopilot. The plane was diving at a steep angle. The captain's body and arms were being buffeted by the strong wind. The captain's arms were spread wide backward as the wind was blowing against the captain from the opposite direction at kilometers per hour. The co-pilot thought the captain was dead. The airplane was gaining more speed and the dive angle was increasing with the forward thrust of the stick. The passengers could not understand what was happening. They only felt that they were falling rapidly. The co-pilot was unable to take control of the plane. The cockpit door was also broken due to the pressure difference. The cabin attendant entered the cockpit with difficulty understanding what had happened. The cabin attendant saw the captain's body stuck out of the window. When he saw the pilot in that state, he grabbed his legs and held him tightly so that he would not come out completely. The other cabin attendants were trying to calm the passengers while at the same time they were trying to secure the items scattered in the cabin. Meanwhile, they were traveling at 345 miles per hour. The co-pilot was trying to take control of the plane, which was out of balance against the strong wind coming in through the gap of the blown window. Freezing air at -17 degrees was hitting the captain's face and body at a speed of 345 miles per hour. The captain's body seemed to be stuck to the top of the cockpit because of this strong wind. No matter how much the cabin attendant grabbed his legs and tried to pull him back, his efforts were insufficient. Under normal circumstances, in an emergency, pilots share duties and their workload is reduced. But this time the co-pilot was on his own. He was trying to get the rapidly descending plane out of the dive. So he wasn't focusing on the captain. He was trying to fly the plane and report the emergency to the air traffic controller. The wind was so strong that the co-pilot's voice went across, but the controller's voice didn't reach the co-pilot. As the plane continued to descend, it kept gaining speed. The wind affecting the captain, who was stuck to the outer surface of the plane, increased to 380 miles per hour. The strong wind combined with the cold was causing damage to the captain's body. Finally, the cabin crew managed to free the captain's feet from the yoke. The co-pilot was now able to take control of the plane more easily. By reducing the bank angle of the plane, he started to make a more stable descent. On top of all this, two different dangers were waiting for the pilot. First of all, their location was in a very busy air traffic area. They were diving in one of the busiest airspaces in the world, posing a danger to other planes below them. If the two planes collided, it could have been a much bigger disaster. The second danger was that the crew experienced an emergency at 16,000 feet. There is not enough oxygen for the human body at these levels. Staying at these altitudes for a long time meant that they would pass out after a certain period. You may be wondering why they didn't use an oxygen mask. Because the plane was old, there was no oxygen supply for all the passengers on board, so the co-pilot preferred to descend and land as soon as possible. They had given up on the captain. He was descending at maximum speed. He descended to 11,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. When they descended to these levels, the co-pilot, with the help of the cabin attendants who had entered the cockpit, pulled back the damaged throttle levers and reduced their speed to 300 knots. The plane finally stabilized and began to slow down. The captain's body, which was outside, was being held against the plane by the violent wind coming from the opposite direction. As their speed decreased, the force of the wind hitting the captain also decreased and his body began to roll sideways. The cabin crew and co-pilot could see the captain's head and body through the window. They noted that the captain's eyes remained open and he never blinked. The crew, exhausted from holding the captain's legs when they saw that he was motionless, asked the co-pilot if they should leave the captain's body there. The co-pilot ordered them not to leave it there because it could go backwards and hit the wings and engines, causing damage to the flight surfaces and causing them to crash. It was a wise decision to keep the captain's motionless body there. The co-pilot had made a very good decision. He was single-handedly getting the plane ready for landing. The checklist had gone out the window with the captain, so the co-pilot was performing the items one by memory. The co-pilot was able to establish clear communication with the tower as their speed decreased. The controller told the co-pilot that they were clear to land at the nearest airport, Southampton. The co-pilot did not know that airport well and requested to land at Gatwick, which he was more familiar with. But since Southampton was closer, the tower officer specifically stated that it was the nearest airport. The co-pilot knew that they had to land as soon as possible, so he told the controller that it was okay and that they would head to Southampton. With the window flying out, the pilot's maps had also flown. The co-pilot would now try to land the plane by visual landing. The tower staff also had a very big challenge because they had to direct the plane to the runway at the appropriate altitude and angle as soon as possible. Flight 5390 was finally identified on radar 9 kilometers west of Southampton. The co-pilot contacted the tower and told them that they were ready for any assistance from the tower. He informed the controller that the captain pilot's body was stuck outside and that he had probably lost his life. He requested an emergency crew. There was more fuel on board than there should have been because the emergency had happened very soon after takeoff, so they hadn't burned enough fuel. This meant that the stopping distances would be even longer than they should have been. The co-pilot asked if the runway was longer than 2.5 kilometers when the controller said that the runway was 1,800 meters long. The co-pilot got a little more nervous. He had to put his wheels at the very beginning of the runway, otherwise they would not be able to stop and they would go off the runway. At 8:55, the co-pilot made a successful approach, extended the landing gear and landed on the 1,800-meter-long Southampton runway. The co-pilot, who made a successful landing in the face of the emergency without anyone's help, could not hold back his tears after landing. The passengers were immediately evacuated from the front and rear exits by the emergency crews. The emergency crews took the captain's body and transferred it to the ambulance. When the paramedics checked the captain's pulse, they miraculously realized that the captain's pulse was beating. The captain was showing signs of life. The entire crew was astonished, thinking that the captain was dead. The captain had lost consciousness the moment he was thrown out of the first window and hit the fuselage of the airplane, so he had short-term memory loss after the incident. Days later, he began to recall his experiences one by one. The captain testified that he was suddenly pulled upward, but that the impact didn't hurt him so much. He said he couldn't breathe because of the 550-knot wind blowing in his face. He said that when he could not breathe, he turned his head backward, found a suitable angle, and was able to breathe. As airplanes increase in altitude, the air temperature decreases. This corresponds to 2 degrees for every 1,000 feet. To explain this with a simple example, the air temperature that day was 17 degrees Celsius, and since they were at 17,000 feet, the air temperature at that altitude dropped by 34 degrees to minus 17 degrees Celsius. The captain's body suffered frostbite due to the minus 17 degrees Celsius air temperature. The captain also suffered fractures in his body, but despite all this, he managed to survive. So, why did the incident happen? When the investigators examined the broken windshield, they could not detect any structural damage to the windshield frame. Since there was no broken window, it could not have been a bird strike, so what was the problem? When they examined the aircraft's maintenance records, they found that the windshield had been replaced only 27 hours earlier. When they talked to the engineer who put the windshield in, they found that the cockpit window was held in place with smaller screws. The engineer had come to the hangar the previous day and removed the windshield. He had tried to find the same size screws by eye, but the screws he removed and reinstalled were 1/100th of an inch thinner than the ones he had removed. It was very difficult for him to notice this with the naked eye. In short, the engineer had installed the screws he knew from experience on the windshield instead of installing the numbers written in the flight manual. Moreover, he had talked about it with his colleague before installing them, but he still did it his way. When the bolts were insufficient, the pressurized air inside the aircraft burst through the weak cockpit window and blew out. In this case, there was also a problem with the design of the aircraft. Under normal conditions, aircraft windows are designed to be installed from the inside so that the pressure inside the aircraft does not turn into such a danger as the altitude increases. Installing the window from the inside is even more advantageous. But in this UK-built aircraft model, the windows were designed to be mounted from the outside. Fortunately, another mistake in aviation was avoided without anyone losing their lives. After the accident, more care was taken in aircraft design and maintenance. The flight crew received many awards for their almost flawless management of the emergency. Especially the co-pilot's management of this incident was a great success. After the tragic events, Captain Pilot Tim returned to his profession exactly 5 months later and continued to take his place in the left seat. After all he had been through, Captain Pilot Tim continued his flight life in another airline even after he retired from the company.